Characteristics of indifference curve. Indifference curve slopes downward to the right. As shown from this figure, the indifference curve slopes downward to the right. This is an important and obvious feature of indifference curve. The sloping down indifference curve indicates that when the amount of one commodity in the combination is increased, as X increases, the amount of the other commodity is reduced. Individual or consumer must have to give up the quantity of Y. This must be so if the level of satisfaction is to remain constant on the same indifference curve. As we increase X from X to X1, the consumption of Y must be reduced in order to keep consumer at the same indifference curve. If we don't do so, then the individual will move on the higher indifference curve. If we increase the consumption of X, means if individual increase the consumption of X, keeping consumption of Y constant. If individual increase the consumption of X, keeping the consumption of Y constant, will move on the higher indifference curve. This I say is more further from origin. So it indicates higher level of satisfaction. When individual keep the consumption of one commodity constant and increase the consumption of other commodity, it will move on the higher indifference curve. So to remain constant on the same indifference curve, to remain at the same utility level, individual must have to give up one commodity in order to increase the consumption of other commodity. This is the indifference curve schedule. As we have seen that the slope of the indifference curve is negative, we can calculate slope from this schedule. Change in Y over change in X, this is the formula of slope. Change in Y, how can we calculate change? Final value minus initial value. Final value minus initial value means if we move from consumption bundle A to B, this is your X, we measure apples on the X axis and it's your Y, oranges on the Y axis. When individual move from point A to point or consumption bundle A to consumption bundle B, change in Y is the final value of Y 7 minus the initial value of Y 10. Initial individual was consuming 10 units. Divided by change in X. Change means again final value minus initial value. This is the final value of X and it's the initial value of X. 2 minus 1 means the slope or the marginal rate of substitution is minus 10, 7 minus 10 minus 3 divided by 1. So the slope is minus 3. When individual move from B to C, the marginal rate of substitution or the slope of the indifference curve is minus 2. Again the final value is 5 and the initial value is 7. 5 minus 7 is minus 2. 3 minus 2 is 1. And when individual move from C to D, this MRS or marginal rate of substitution is minus 1. Here minus sign indicates that the slope of the indifference curve is negative, as we have seen from previous slide. But it also diminishing. The slope is diminishing. MRS, marginal rate of substitution, is diminishing. That indicates that indifference curves are convex to the origin. Indifference curves are always convex to the origin. The convexity rule implies that as the consumer substitute X for Y, the marginal rate of substitution diminishes. It means that as the amount of X is increased by equal amount, that of Y diminished by a smaller amount. We know that when the amount of one commodity increases, law of diminishing marginal utility says that the marginal utility received from the consumption of that commodity decreases. Therefore, individual is willing to give up lesser and lesser amount of other commodity to get one more unit of X or first commodity. This is the indifference curve, IC. IC means the indifference curve. A, B, C, D are the different consumption bundle. An individual is indifferent between all these bundles as shown from the figure. This is the same indifference because they all belongs to a same indifference curve. It means it gives individual a same level of satisfaction. In comparison to point A, point B shows that consumer get more of X while quantity of Y remain constant. At point B, consumer have more of X while keeping Y constant. More always gives more satisfaction or more utility as per monotonicity, the assumption we assumed earlier. But here we see that after increasing the quantity of X, consumer is still on the same indifference curve. It shows that commodity X is a neutral commodity. Neutral commodity means the marginal utility received from the consumption of commodity X is neutral commodity means marginal utility received from the consumption of commodity X is 0. Marginal utility received from the consumption of commodity X is 0. X is neutral commodity. That's why the indifference curve is parallel to the horizontal axis. But here preferences are not well behaved. The assumption monotonicity is violating here. Similarly, this IC is parallel to the vertical axis. A, B, C, D, all the consumption bundles are on the same indifference curve, indicates that individual receive same level of utility or same level of satisfaction from all those bundles. In point D, the consumer gets more of Y. At this point, individual gets more of Y than at point A, B, C, while keeping the quantity of X constant. Here consumption of X is constant and consumption of Y is increasing. So the consumer cannot be indifferent to the combination as per the assumption. If Y increases, it means that individual must have to move on the higher indifference curve. But here we can see that individual remains on the same indifference curve. Again, Y is a neutral commodity and the marginal utility received from the consumption of Y is 0. Because of this, individual will not move at the higher indifference curve. Again, here the assumption monotonicity is violating. Both goods are not good here. The commodity Y is not good here. Marginal utility received from the consumption of Y is 0. Y is a neutral commodity. In the previous slide, X was neutral commodity means the marginal utility received from the consumption of X was 0. But in this slide, Y is neutral commodity. The marginal utility received from the consumption of Y is 0. Therefore, individual remains at the same indifference curve when it increases the consumption of Y. It's another case. Again, point A, B, C, D are all at the same indifference curve. If the preferences are well behaved, then the upward sloping RC is not possible. We assume that both goods are goods. If both goods are good, it means that individual must have to move on a higher indifference curve when the consumption of any commodity increases. But here we can see that the consumption of both commodities is increasing, but individual remains at the same indifference curve. At point A, in consumption bundle A, both X and Y are in a lesser amount than point B. But point A and point B both are on the same indifference curve, means individuals are indifferent between these two consumption bundles. How is it possible? It's only possible when one of the commodity, either Y or X, is bad good. Bad good means the good that gives you negative marginal utility. Bad good is the good that gives you a negative marginal utility. When here we assume that Y is bad commodity, X is a good commodity. When we increase the consumption of X, marginal utility of X is positive. Individual moves to the higher indifference curve, but simultaneously individual is increasing the commodity consumption of commodity Y, and Y is a bad commodity. It gives individual or consumer a negative level of satisfaction, negative utility. Both positive and negative offset each other, and individual remains at the same indifference curve. It's only possible, it means positive slope indifference curve indicate that one of the commodity or one of the consumption bundle is bad for individual. It gives individual negative satisfaction, or the marginal utility received from the consumption from bad commodity is negative. Indifference curve cannot intersect each other. This is another property of indifference curve, and also cannot touch either axis. They cannot intersect each other, they cannot touch either axis, they cannot touch each other. Why they cannot touch either axis? We have assumed that both commodities are partially substituted commodities. They are not perfect substitute of each other. So individual cannot reduce the consumption of any commodity to zero. It's not possible to consume zero amount of any commodity because the commodities are not perfectly substituted. Individual always consume both commodity in a combination. Indifference curve cannot intersect each other, so that one indifference curve passes through only one point on the indifference map. In this figure, two indifference curves I1 and I2 are intersecting each other. Point C in the indifference map belongs to two indifference curves. That is not possible if preferences are well behaved. If all the assumptions satisfied, then this would be impossible that one consumption bundle or one point belongs to two utility level or two different indifference curves. As per transitivity, we assume transitivity. Transitivity implies that if A and C, because both A and C belongs to same indifference curve I1, it means individual is indifferent between point consumption bundle A and C. These two bundles are indifferent to one another. B and C belongs to a same indifference curve. It means these two consumption bundles are also indifferent to one another. B is indifferent to C. A is indifferent to C and C is indifferent to B. It implies that A also be indifferent to B if preferences are transitive. If transitivity holds, then A must be indifferent to B. But we can see that point B is on the lower indifference curve because it is nearer to origin, and point A is away from origin, means it shows the higher utility, or it belongs to a higher indifference curve relative to point B. It's not possible if the preferences are transitive. Here the transitivity violated. In the similar way, in this graph, A and C belongs to I1, B and C belongs to, this is I1, this is I2, A and C belongs to I2 and B and C belongs to I1, because I2 is away from origin, further away from origin than I1. Again, point C, this consumption bundle give individual two level of satisfaction that is not possible if the preferences are well behaved and the transitivity hold. These are two extreme scenarios, perfect substitutes and perfect complements. Here the goods are perfect substitute to one another. Individual regards the goods are perfectly interchangeable. Consumer consider that two goods are identical, or any one unit of one good as exactly the same as any one unit of other good. There is no difference among these two goods. These goods are perfect substitutes. When the goods are perfect substitute, the indifference curve is a straight line, and along the line the marginal rate of substitution is constant. Because goods are identical, so to consume one more unit of commodity X or Q1, individual is willing to give up one unit of Y. There is 1-to-1 ratio along the curve. And here is a possibility that individual consume only one commodity Q1 keeping the consumption of other commodity 0, or consume only Q2 keeping the consumption of Q1 0. The other extreme case is perfect complements, complementary goods. In this type of preferences, individual consider that the two goods should be consumed together. Consumer regards having more of one good without having more of the other as being pointless. It's useless to increase the consumption of one good keeping the consumption of other good constant. So if consumer increase the consumption of Q1 only, individual will remain on the same indifference curve. Similarly, if individual increase the consumption of Y only, it will remain on the same indifference curve. So it's useless or pointless, or the Q1 became neutral if it's not increased in the combination of Q2. Individual only increase the consumption of both commodity with the same ratio. then it will move on the higher indifference curve. In this case, when the two goods are complement good, the indifference curve will be L-shaped. And here the margin rate of substitution is not uniquely defined. MRS is not uniquely defined in this case. Okay, these are the two extreme scenarios when the goods are not partially substituted. Either they are perfect substitute or complementary goods. In the next lecture, we will discuss the budget line. Thank you.